Have you ever wondered why, even when you believe you're in control, you so often act as if being led by invisible forces? What if I told you that what we call free will is, in many cases, just the most brilliantly staged illusion of our time? We live in a theater of appearances, where the desire to be accepted, admired, or loved can become an emotional leash, and the scariest part, one we put on ourselves. In this video, we're going behind the scenes of silent power, into the strategies that turn relationships into arenas of invisible domination. You'll see that the most skilled manipulators rarely seem threatening, and that the most effective traps don't bind the body but the mind. Get ready to question what once seemed harmless. And most of all, to ask yourself, how many of my choices are really mine? We all wear masks. Some are subtle, others theatrical. But they all share one purpose: to hide the fear of not being loved. The desire to be admired is one of the most powerful forces in human behavior, and also one of the most dangerous. When we need others' validation to feel whole, we leave ourselves vulnerable to having that very need used against us. The manipulator knows this. They watch the light in your eyes when you're praised, the disguised anxiety when you feel ignored. That's where they act. Curiously, the more we try to appear invincible, the easier it is to spot our cracks. Emotional armor shines too brightly, it draws attention. Excessive pride, performative self-sufficiency, forced laughter behind insecurity, it all exposes a human being desperately seeking acceptance. True strength, on the other hand, lives in the silence of someone who's made peace with their vulnerabilities. Being invincible is an illusion sold by those most afraid of their own. Nietzsche said, "Man is something that shall be overcome." And perhaps that overcoming begins precisely when we stop pretending we're already complete. The mask is comfortable, but it doesn't set us free. It protects us from the eyes of others, but also imprisons us in the character we invented to survive. The problem is, the longer we wear the disguise, the more we forget who we are beneath it. And in that, the manipulator doesn't even need to lie, they only need to reinforce the image we've created of ourselves. We're fascinated by the social mirror. We crave applause, recognition, belonging. But in pursuing it so desperately, we become dependent on those who hand us crumbs of admiration. The first step to being manipulated is to need other people's opinions too much. Because someone afraid of losing the mask lives at the mercy of whoever threatens to remove it. And the great tragedy is that, by protecting it so fiercely, we end up hiding the most beautiful thing about us: human imperfection. A scream, no matter how loud, reveals anxiety. It's the tool of someone who needs to convince by force, to impose presence, to dominate through noise. But real power needs no spectacle, it hides in subtle gestures, attentive listening, and a silent presence that perceives everything. The experienced manipulator doesn't shout. They observe. They know silence is more unsettling than 1,000 words, because it leaves the other alone with themselves. And in that confrontation, people often surrender without realizing it. Seduction is an art that requires patience. You must wait for the right moment to act without seeming like you're acting at all. A skilled manipulator plants ideas like seeds. They don't demand, they suggest. They don't order, they hint. And in doing so, they allow the other to believe they are making their own decisions. The power lies in knowing how to remain quiet when everyone else wants to speak, and in allowing the other to reveal their desires, fears, and weaknesses without realizing they're being read. There's a subtle brutality in silence. It can be more violent than any direct confrontation precisely because it is interpretive. The silent one becomes a mirror, and the reflection isn't always pleasant. Silence unbalances, unsettles, provokes the desperate need to fill the void with words, and that's when truth slips out. The manipulator knows this. They don't rush the conversation, they slow it down. They don't respond, they observe. And at that rhythm they lead. Plato wrote, "The wise man speaks because he has something to say, the fool because he has to say something." That principle captures the essence of silent power. Speaking less is a choice made by those who have nothing to prove. And those who don't need to prove anything become a threat to those who live off appearances. In this context, silence isn't the absence of voice, it's full presence. A presence that watches without haste, understands without judgment, and dominates without detection. There's something we all have in common, though we rarely admit it: secret fear. Not the surface-level fear of losing a job or status, but the deep fear that shapes our most intimate decisions. It might be fear of rejection, of being insignificant, of not being loved. To survive, the human mind has learned to hide these fears even from itself. We build masks, routines, and justifications to avoid facing what truly terrifies us. And this is exactly where the manipulator gains access. Deciphering someone's secret fear is like opening an invisible door. It takes sensitivity, active listening, and the patience of someone who knows the other will reveal their weakness slowly, often unknowingly. The manipulator doesn't force the revelation. They watch gestures, silences, poorly chosen words. They notice what is most intensely avoided. And once they see the pattern, they know exactly where to press. No need to raise their voice. Just press the right spot with surgical precision. When someone discovers our deepest fear, we form a bond of emotional dependence with them. The logic is subtle. Those who understand our pain hold power over our decisions. Sometimes that control comes as protection, other times as threat. In both cases, the control remains. A true manipulator doesn't confront, they comfort. They offer relief in exchange for obedience. And this dynamic is so effective because it wears the disguise of care, of partnership, even of love. Pascal's philosophy reminds us that the heart has its reasons which reason knows nothing of. And maybe that's why we're so vulnerable to those who understand our fears before we do. The deepest kind of control doesn't happen in a shout, but in the gesture that touches where we're most fragile. That's why so many submit without noticing. They believe they're being nurtured when in fact they're being read like an open book, by someone who already knows exactly which page to turn. The human mind values, above almost all else, the sensation of autonomy. We like to believe we make our own decisions, that we are the masters of our fate. But the paradox is cruel. The more certain we are that we've chosen freely, the more vulnerable we are to invisible influences. Perfect manipulation operates in that blind spot. It doesn't impose, it inspires. And in doing so, it convinces us the idea was ours, when in fact, it was carefully implanted. To control someone without them realizing it is a refined art. It requires a delicate emotional architecture, where the manipulator plants scenarios, alternatives, and disguised desires. They offer choices that, in truth, always lead to the same destination. There's no resistance because there's no coercion. The other acts with enthusiasm, fiercely defending a decision they believe they made on their own, unaware of the invisible strings that led them there. This technique is like an emotional magic trick, distracting from the real intention. The manipulator doesn't tell you what to do, they create an environment where the only viable option seems to be what they want. They use questions instead of commands, doubt instead of certainty. Doubt, in fact, is a powerful ally. By planting uncertainty and then offering a convincing solution, they become the guide, and those seeking direction rarely question who appears to know the way. Jean-Jacques Rousseau said, "Man is born free, but everywhere he is in chains." The most effective chain is the one disguised as freedom. When control is framed as choice, it doesn't provoke resistance. And in this context, the dominator doesn't need to yell, threaten, or coerce. They only need to understand your desires better than you do. Because whoever controls the narrative of desire, controls everything. There is a key that opens doors brute force could never touch: praise. But not just any praise. The effective kind isn't generic, automatic, or exaggerated. It's the one that hits the right note at the right moment, the one that seems to see something unique in the person hearing it. The human ego craves recognition. It doesn't just want acceptance, it wants to feel special. When someone offers that subtly, it plants an emotional debt. And those who feel indebted tend to repay it with quiet obedience. The ego is the most manipulable point because it always lies just beneath the surface. It reacts quickly, whether to flattery or to criticism. The manipulator doesn't need aggression when they can guide through pleasure. Well-crafted praise creates a sense of exclusivity, as if the person is being seen on a deeper level, even if it's just a strategic read on behavior. Feeling valued, the person lowers their guard and opens their heart. And their mind. It's in this state of openness that control occurs. The praised person, consumed by gratitude or vanity, becomes more pliable. They accept suggestions as wise counsel. They follow directions as though repaying a favor. In this game, the manipulator isn't a tyrant, they're an admiring companion. Or at least that's what it seems. And it's precisely that appearance of affection that makes everything more dangerous. Because we don't suspect someone who praises sweetly, only someone who threatens harshly. Lao Tzu once said, "He who controls others is strong. He who controls himself is powerful." A manipulator who understands the power of ego doesn't need to raise their voice. They simply offer what the other most wants to hear. And with that, they turn someone's vanity into invisible reins. Because, in the end, no one resists the feeling of being admired for long, especially when that admiration is disguised as intimacy and understanding. Emotional domination doesn't begin with imposition, but with deconstruction. It's like dismantling a house before rebuilding it with a new architecture, except this house is the person's identity. The process starts slowly, Small criticisms disguised as advice, subtle comparisons, doubts slipped into compliments. The goal is to undermine self-esteem without direct resistance. The more subtle the erosion, the more effective it becomes. Because the person doesn't realize they're being broken, they think they're being shaped. Depersonalization is a silent attack on internal security. The victim begins to doubt their opinions, tastes, even their memory. Am I overreacting? Did I misunderstand? Maybe they're right. These questions become constant. And when inner reference points are shaken, a human naturally seeks a new source of stability. That's when the manipulator offers the solution, themselves. With their truths, their certainties, their standards. The rebuilding then happens through calculated affection, selective validation, and promises of belonging. The manipulator becomes not just a partner but a mirror. The victim starts to mold themselves to please them, trying to recover the sense of worth that was subtly taken away. It's a perverse cycle. First the emotional foundation is destroyed, then a new floor is offered, one that only exists under the feet of the one who controls. And because it's all done in silence, the victim often believes they're being helped, not controlled. Freud reminded us that the mind is like an iceberg, it floats with 7/8 of its bulk below the surface. Emotional manipulation operates precisely in that submerged part. It doesn't need shouting or chains. It's enough to frequently question who the person is, until they themselves begin to forget. And then gently offer the answer, you could be this. And they accept. Because someone who's lost their voice clings to any echo that sounds familiar. Being accepted by everyone may seem like the pinnacle of human interaction, but it carries a hidden warning. Someone who pleases everyone is probably hiding something. Authenticity is naturally polarizing. It takes courage to reveal flaws, unpopular thoughts, vulnerabilities. And that scares people. Because being authentic means risking rejection. In contrast, manipulation is charming. It adapts to the environment, says what others want to hear, shapes behavior to the crowd's taste. A successful manipulator rarely seeks confrontation. They don't need to be honest, just seem trustworthy. Their gestures are calculated, their language carefully chosen. They observe before revealing, adapt before exposing. This way they build a magnetic persona that's hard to resist. But this image is not who they are, it's just a socially convenient version. Emotional camouflage is their most powerful tool. They dissolve into others to conquer them. This kind of social skill is often confused with charisma, but it's really strategy. A manipulator doesn't say what they think, they say what works. They know the truth pushes people away but illusion draws them in. So they don't hesitate to sacrifice authenticity for acceptance. Their greatest skill is reading the room and fitting in without friction. They appear flexible, friendly, understanding, and in doing so, earn the trust they'll later use as a key to control. Soren Kierkegaard said, "Most people are so superficial they don't even know what it means to be true to themselves." This is the perfect ground for manipulation. A world where people fear disappointing others, where social rejection matters more than personal integrity. In that logic, those loved by all are probably hiding something essential. Because authenticity unsettles, confronts, and inevitably filters. Manipulation, with its pleasant mask, unites only to dominate later. Truth has a curious power, it doesn't need to be said to have an effect. Its shadow hanging over a conversation, a look, a well-placed silence is enough. The threat of revelation is often more powerful than the revelation itself. Because what we imagine tends to be more intense than what really is. The fear of discovering something that might shake our certainty creates an emotional prison, and the manipulator knows how to turn that fear into an invisible chain. To insinuate is a subtle act of domination. When truth is spoken plainly, it can be faced, denied, challenged. But when it's only suggested, it lodges in the mind as a corrosive doubt. What if it's true? That question echoes in the mind, weakening confidence and generating anxiety. In that tense state, any gesture from the manipulator gains power, becomes more influential. They don't need to apply pressure just to imply. This type of control works like silent emotional blackmail. There are no direct threats, just the suggestion that something could be uncovered. And the other, driven by fear, becomes obedient. It's a game of perception. What matters is not what is known, but what is hinted at. Doubt becomes the true prison. And the manipulator, in this setup, presents themselves as the only one capable of guarding a secret, even if that secret doesn't exist. Machiavelli wrote, "Men must either be caressed or annihilated." But there's a third way even more effective. Keep them suspended. The sense that something is hidden, about to be revealed, is enough to paralyze decisions, undermine resistance, and generate submission. Because deep down, humans fear the possibility of pain more than pain itself. And those who understand that don't need evidence, just a gesture, a vague word, a precise insinuation. The most absolute form of control doesn't impose, it invites. And that invitation rarely feels like a trap, it feels like a choice. True power lies in awakening in the other the desire to be guided. When someone feels protected, valued, or needed within a relationship of dependency, they gladly surrender their freedom. Voluntary servitude is the most dangerous form of obedience, because it stirs no resistance. It's built on affection, comfort, and above all, ego. Once the manipulator sees that the other wants to be controlled, they become a safe harbor. They offer direction when there's confusion, stability when there's doubt, recognition when there's neediness. But nothing is free, the price is emotional submission. The dominated person begins to live for the approval of the one who leads them. And in this game, the more pleasure they feel in pleasing, the blinder they become to the nature of the relationship. Control, then, is no longer a burden, it becomes a privilege. This dynamic is common in romantic, professional, even ideological relationships. The dominator no longer needs to command, they just need to exist as a reference. They become the filter through which the other interprets the world. Decisions are validated by them, emotions are mediated by them, identity is built around them. And the scariest part is that the victim believes they're in control. The illusion of autonomy is maintained, because it was they who chose to submit. Etienne de la Boétie, in his essay The Discourse of Voluntary Servitude, already warned, "To enslave people, just let them consent to be enslaved." The pleasure of the dominated is the dominator's most sophisticated trump card. Where there is pleasure, there is no revolt. The desire to belong, to be useful, to please, all of it can be weaponized. And when obedience is born from desire, there's no need for chains. Just a bond. And in that bond often lies the most subtle and lasting prison. The art of manipulation begins with listening, not speaking. And the most strategic listening is that which deciphers desires. Knowing what someone most wants, whether love, recognition, security, power, or belonging, is like having the key to an emotional vault. When someone reveals, even unintentionally, what they desire most, they also reveal where they are most vulnerable. And that vulnerability in the right hands becomes control. Because whoever holds someone's desire governs their behavior. The skilled manipulator doesn't impose their will, they offer a promise. A vision, an idea, a future where that desire will finally be fulfilled. It doesn't even have to be a lie, it just has to be seductive. The right promise is the most efficient hook because it connects with what the person already wants. And at that point, obedience becomes voluntary, even enthusiastic. The other doesn't feel they're being led, they feel they're chasing what's rightfully theirs. That's why manipulation through desire is more effective than control through fear. Fear paralyzes, but desire moves. And the manipulator knows that someone motivated by pleasure surrenders faster than someone coerced by pain. They feed that desire with attention, with symbols, with promises that make the eyes light up. And when they see the person is addicted to the idea of attaining it, they pull back. Let the person beg, insist, offer themselves. Power at that point has already changed hands. This is the essence of deep emotional control, understanding that desires are not chosen, they are discovered and nourished. The manipulator doesn't invent a desire, they find it and amplify it. And once that desire is under their control, they no longer need permission. Because the other, enchanted by the promise, will do whatever it takes to reach it, even if it costs them their freedom. If there's one thing that unites all forms of manipulation, it's that they don't impose, they suggest. The most effective control presents itself as affection, care, guidance. And perhaps the most unsettling realization is that we often hand over the keys to our autonomy with a smile, fooled by the illusion that we are choosing. This journey we've taken isn't about paranoia, it's about clarity. It's not about seeing manipulators around every corner, but about understanding how the invisible mechanisms that move us actually work. True reflection begins when we ask ourselves, why do I need so badly to be accepted? Why does disappointing someone bother me so much? Why do I find myself repeating patterns I never consciously chose? Manipulation, in the end, is a dance between desire and fear. And we can only interrupt that rhythm when we learn to recognize our own steps. Now, with this awareness in hand, maybe you'll look at certain relationships with new eyes. And perhaps begin to cultivate a kind of power that isn't based on dominating anyone, but on no longer being dominated. Comment below, what part of this spoke to you the most? And if you could free one part of yourself from invisible control, what would it be? If this content gave you a new perspective, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications.